In this lesson, we're going to be talking about domain and range. But before we do that, let's review function notation that we talked about in our last lesson. So, given the function f defined by the formula f of x equals 2x plus 1, find the following. All right, so we'll do one together, and then I want you to try the rest of them on your own. So remember from last time, when you have this number inside of the parentheses, that is going to be your input or x value. So in order to find f of 4, right, if I want to find f of 4, I'm going to plug in 4 for x and solve this out, right? So whenever it's inside the parentheses, that's my input, and I'm going to plug it in for x and solve it out. So I get 2 times 4 is 8, 8 plus 1 is 9, and my final answer here would be 9. All right, you're going to try B through D on your own. Go ahead and pause the video and do those on your own. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and tried those out on your own. So the first one, B, you're doing f of -5, just plugging in -5 and you should get -9. For f of 0, you should have gotten 1, and then for f of 1/2, when you plug that in, you should get 2. So check your answers there, see if you did them right, and then we're going to move on to domain and range today. All right, so go ahead and write down these definitions. The domain is the inputs, right? We've talked about inputs and outputs before, right? So the domain is going to be the same thing as your inputs. You could also describe it as the independent variable, but the best way I think to describe domain is going to be the x values, right? So this is going to be super important. We're going to be using this a ton for this unit and this year, right? So domain is your x values. You're going to see that over and over again. The range, we can describe it by the outputs or the dependent variable. But again, the most often you're going to see it, range is meaning the y values. So your domain is your x values, your range is the y values. How I remember it, domain starts with a D, kind of goes in alphabetical order, right? So domain starts with a D, goes in alphabetical order, so x comes first, and then the range starts with an R, goes in alphabetical order, y comes next, right? So that's how I remember it, but I think you're going to see these words over and over again. Hopefully you get used to them. Domain is your x values, your range is your y values. So some examples using these pictures here, right? Domain is your x values, right? So if you're looking at the domain of something, you want to look left to right to look at the domain, right? So you want to look left to right to look at the domain. To look at your range, you are going to look up and down. So to look at your range, you are looking up and down to look at your range right here. All right, and again, we said the domain is our x values. That's these values right here. So if I listed them out, I would just list out those x values. The range is going to be the y values. So if I listed them out, I would just list out the y values right here, right? So that is what domain and range are. And now we're going to go over examples on how to list them out down here using a graph and using coordinates. So make sure you have those definitions written down, and then we're going to move on to example 1. All right, moving on to example 1. If I wanted to list out the domain of this graph, I want to look at the x values. Right, so let's look at our x values here. So my first point here is at -2. I usually like to use these brackets when I'm listing out points. The next one is going to be at -1. These are both at 1, and these are both at 3. So when I'm listing out my domain, I'm looking from left to right. Okay, so make sure you have that down. I'm going to erase the board, and then we're going to look at range. All right, looking at range, I want to look up and down. So range is my y values. That's going to be looking up and down. So let's start at our lowest one here. So the range, I could say one of the values is -2, because both of those are at -2. This guy is going to be at 0. These two are both at 1. And then this last one here is at 3. So for my range, again, I'm looking up and down. So I find -2, 0, 1, and 3 for my range. All right. I'm going to go ahead and erase that, and then we're going to figure out, is this a function, yes or no? All right, so looking at this, remember our vertical line test. This was from our first objective. If I want to tell if something is a function, I can use the vertical line test to do that. If I draw a vertical line anywhere on this graph, if it passes through 2 points, that is not okay. This is not a function, right? Because two of those inputs because one input has 2 different outputs, it is not a function. Looking at example 2, I'm going to first list my domain and range. Remember, back to our definition, our domain is just going to be our x values. This should be super easy to see. My domain is going to be -2, 0, 5, and I'm not going to list that -2 again because I already have it listed. So that's my domain. My range is going to be all my y values. You only need to list each once. So my range is going to be -1, 3, 4, and that is it. I don't need to list that 3 again. Well, is this a function? Remember back to our function rules, if I have the same input going to 2 different outputs, this is not going to be a function. So no, this would not be a function because that -2 goes to both -1 and 3, so not a function. All right, so go ahead and try the your turns. There's going to be 4 your turns down here to try out. Very similar to the example we did, so use the example to help you out. Go ahead and pause the video right now. Make sure you pause it, and then we will go through them. Pause the video. All right, going through these, our domain for the first one. Remember, for the domain, I'm looking at all my x values. So I would look -2, this one's at -1, this one's at 1, and this one's at 3. All right. And then for my range, I'm looking at the y values. So that would be at -4, -2, at 0, and at 1. The last question is asking for, is this a function, yes or no? I didn't answer that one yet because I want to go over that one more time. So remember, this one is not going to be a function because it doesn't pass that vertical line test. If I drew a vertical line through the graph, it would pass through both of those points. So this is not a function. Example B is a function because if I drew a vertical line through each of these, it's only going through 1 point each time. All right, and check out that domain and range. Make sure you check that out, see if you got those correct. C and D should be pretty easy to list out the domain and range. Your domain is just your x's, your range is just your y's. So for if this is a function, yes or no, look at your x values, right? If all the inputs are different, it is a function. For D, all of our inputs are not different, so this one is not a function. All right, so hopefully that one went okay. My domain, remember, is my x values, and then my range is my y values when I list those out. All right, so let's move on to example 2. So these are going to get a little trickier. So now for these graphs, they're what's called continuous graphs because they keep going, But I want to do something very similar to find the domain and range. So we'll do that in just a bit. So let's look at some review here. We're going to evaluate the function at f of -3. So this should be a little bit of a review from our last lesson on function notation. F of -3, if I'm looking for this, I want to look for where x is at -3. So that's going to be right here. And I'm going to go up to my graph. Okay, well, what is y when x is -3? That's just going to be at 1. Let's look at f of 1. So I want to look where x is 1, go down to my graph here, so I see it intersects at -3 for my y. And then my last one, f of 3, that's going to be right here. So I go all the way up to my y, I see where that is. It's at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So f of 3 is going to be at 5. I can just count up there to see where that is at. All right, so that should be a bit of a review. Let's look at part B. It says, can the function rule given by the graph give you a value when x is equal to 5? So let's check this out. So I want to look at x is equal to 5 and see if our function rule can give me something out. Well, x is equal to 5 is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. Let's look. If I go up and down there, kind of look to see if my graph is there. My graph is not there, right? So no, because the graph does not exist, at x equals 5. Right, so that function rule does not exist there, right? Because my graph is only right here. This is where I see my graph. So that's moving into our next question. Part C says, is x equal to 5 in the domain of the function? Our domain is our x values, right? Is that one of the x values in this graph right here? Is that one of those x values? No, it is not in the domain. Right, so let's move on to our next page. We're using the same graph here and just answering a couple more questions. It says, give 2 other values of x that are not in the domain. So we want ones that are not in the domain. So maybe back here, right? If I do this x value, that would not be in the domain. So what is that at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So x equals -6 would not be in the domain. Let's try another one. Right here, right? Also not in the domain. And that's at 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are also both not in the domain of the graph, because that doesn't exist. The graph is only right here. So it's limited by those points. Part E asks us to circle the following y values that are in the range of the function. So now we're talking about range. So let's think about, what is range again? So range is going to be the y values of a graph, right? So if we think about a graph, we want to think about, right, that up and down shape, the y values. So it says circle each of the y values that are in the range of the function. Let's start with y equals 0. Y equals 0 is going to be right here. Is this in the range of the function? Yes, because it goes through, right, a bunch of parts of that function. It goes through here, goes through here, goes through here. So yes, that is in the range of the function. So y equals 0 is. Let's look at our next one. Y equals 3. Is that in the range? 1, 2, 3. That's right here. Yeah, it still is, because it still crosses that graph. So it's still in the range. So that one's good. Let's look at our next one. Y equals 6. y equals 6 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up here. Is that in the range? Well, no, that one's not in the range, right? Because it's above that graph. The graph is below that. Let's try a few more. Y equals negative 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is down here. That one's also not in the range, right? Because it's below that graph. Y equals negative 1. That's going to be right here. That one is. And then y equals 4. That's going to be right 4, right here. That one still is because it still crosses through the graph. So this is also good. All right, so hopefully you can see those blue ones are in the range because it's crossing through the graph. Those ones that I crossed out are not in the range because they're either above or below the graph. All right, part F is going to be kind of the meat of this whole lesson, the main part. It says to write the domain and range of this function using a single inequality, and I'll show you exactly how to do that. So the domain is going to be your x values. So you should notice it's starting here and it's ending right here. So you want to figure out what is that span. Well, it's starting at, if I count negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's starting at negative 5 and it's ending at 1, 2, 3. So if I wrote this as a single inequality, it's going to be from negative 5. Its domain, so I want to use x, all the way to 3. So I'm kind of filling in these blanks here. What this basically means is that it's between negative 5 and positive 3. The domain is between negative 5, so that's where it starts, and positive 3, that's where it ends. That's my x values I'm looking at. All right, looking at our y values. For the y values, I want to look up to down. So x is kind of looking left to right. Our y values, we're going to look from our lowest to our highest. So let's look right here. Our lowest y value is at negative 1, 2, 3, 4. That's our lowest y value. Our highest y value is up here. If I count up, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I wrote the range out, I'm going to write this very similarly. So I want to start with my lower number. It's starting at negative 4. That's my lowest. I'm going to put a y in the middle because I'm talking about range. So our range is going to be between negative 4 and our highest number is positive 5. So for the domain and range, you always put the lowest number first and then the highest number last. Domain, remember, is like left to right. Range is lowest to highest, or up to down, down to up. So we're going to be using that quite a bit. All right, I want you to try that your turn on your own. Pause the video right now to try that out, and then we'll go through it together really quickly. Pause the video. All right, hopefully you tried this out on your own. We're going to check some of these answers right now. So for part A, it says to evaluate the following. F of negative 3, if I go to negative 3, I look where it crosses on the graph, and that's going to be at 5. So it's right here at 5. F of 1 is right here, so that crosses at positive 1. And then F of 3 is right here, so that's crossing at negative 1. All right, for part B, it's giving me, it says which of the following is not in the domain of the function. Again, you're kind of checking each part. So f of negative 3, so I'm going on my x value to negative 3. Yep, that's good because it crosses right here. Negative 4, still good. 5, checking that out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's over here. That is not good, right? Because that's too far, right? That graph is only between -5, and +4. So that is not included in the graph. And then 0 is also included. If I just check that out, that's right there. All right. The last one is the most important one we're going to be going over, the domain and range, written in interval in the inequality notation. Okay. So let's look at our domain first. Remember, the domain is from left to right. So it's starting here and it's ending right here. Now all I got to do is just count to see where that's starting and ending. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's starting at -5 and it's ending at 1, 2, 3, 4, +4. So I'd write that as -5 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 4. Basically what that means, if I read that, my domain is between -5 and 4. That's what that means. My range, remember, is up and down. It's our y values. So if I look at our range, I want to look from the lowest to the highest. So our lowest value is going to be right here. That's at -1. And our highest value is right here. Let's count what that is. It's at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So right there. So if I wrote this out, this would be between -1 and 5. And what you should notice is that I put a little y in the middle here because I'm talking about range, and the other one, there's an x in the middle because I'm talking about domain. All right, the last your turn. I want you to try completely on your own. Go ahead and try that one completely on your own. That is for you to do for homework, and then turn in these notes. And then you're going to do the choice activity and the objective quiz after that. All right, so use example 2 in the your turn to help you out with the last your turn. All right, until next time.